feedback from you all. It's going to be a long meeting, as mentioned. You've got paperwork in front of you. Some of you may be more comfortable, verbally expressing, questions and concerns and opinions in this meeting, but we definitely want to hear from everybody. And so that paperwork is going to be critical in the feedback and in the narrowing down of these ideas down to a couple here. Going to lay just what you're going to see here now over the next few minutes. After I step down here, Craig Gordon is going to come up and give you an update on what Stop Quip is up to. And this is obviously a very passionate issue, folks on either side of the issue. But I think it's important that we come at this from a real fact-based perspective. And so trying to move this out of the donut shops and coffee shops into what's actually going on. Craig's going to give that background and let you know exactly what they're up to and what they're talking about. After that, Dino Giacomazzi is going to come up and talk about the United Dairy Families process, which is what we're engaged in here as a group. And then immediately following Dino, you're going to hear from Don Schipelhout, who is with CDFA. And again, this is about taking the rumors and moving it into fact-based discussion. Don's going to give you the background of what does the Food and Ag Code say about if a petition comes in, what does that look like? If one kind of petition versus another, what does that look like? And so really make sure everybody has a full understanding of exactly what the legislative authority is under this QUIP and quota program. And then, of course, Matt and Martin will take us through the rest of the agenda. And so I really appreciate all of your participation. I totally echo Dominic's comments earlier that, hopefully we can all keep very cool heads and open ears and hear what each other's saying. This is a process that we want as much interaction, dialogue, and discussion with the industry as possible. Everyone has an opportunity in this process to weigh in. So with that, I'd ask Craig to come on up and give the Stop Quip perspective.
Thanks, big guy. Good morning. I'm here to tell you what we're doing, so you hear it right from my voice, what we're doing. We have a petition right now with over 335 signatures. We need 248 to submit it. And it's based on the same chapter that we did the first petition, which was Chapter 3 of the Food and Ag Code on its Division 21, Article 21, but it's Chapter 3, which calls for 65% we need of the 51% who vote to win our petition. But we put that on hold a week ago. We're not going to submit it because we believe that we can go under what they call Chapter 3.5 in the Food and Ag Code, which spells out that we only need 51%, well 49.1 for us. 49.1% is all we need as a threshold. And the reason why we made this switch was the QUIP was actually founded in the 3.5 and wasn't in the 3, so it was a mistake on our part, we think, to go through the 3. Anyways, we've had legal counsel on it, and they believe we can win this thing through Chapter 3.5. So we've started the new petition. We already started receiving signatures the last 3 days. We think within probably 30 days we can have that petition ready to go. So we agreed to participate with this United Dairy thing, and we have been. We've been very open with them, very upfront with everything we're doing. We said we weren't going to ever stop on the petition process, and we were hoping that we would come up with some type of agreement where we all be happy with it, and we're still open to that. But it's just been delayed also, and we were supposed to have been done by November 1, and now it's going on to January or February. Well, as soon as we get those signatures, we're going to be ready to put them in by January 1 is what we've told Dino and all these guys. And so we're hoping that we get some type of resolution that we can make everybody happy and everyone involved and whatever the monies might be on that. But that is what we're doing, and it's been 1 year since I started this thing, and I paid $365,000 in 1 year. And the bottom line is we just don't have the money. I don't have the money to keep paying at 38 cents. So if we can get a resolution, the sooner the better. But there's a lot of us out there that we're losing guys right and left, and we're trying to help them out. So thank you again for coming. Dino?
Thanks, Greg. Okay, thank you guys all for coming. And I think I got a slide to put up here real quick here. Let's see. That one. Okay. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dino Giacomazzi. I'm a recovering dairy farmer from Hanford, California. I have now been out of the dairy business for almost exactly 1 week. Thank you to those who came to our sale last week. I really appreciate the support from the industry. So why am I still here talking to you about quota when I'm no longer a dairy farmer? And the answer to that is that I believe that the dairy industry is the most important industry to agriculture in the state, and that even as a farmer of almonds or farmer of something else, I depend on the dairy industry in a lot of ways, to take the almond hulls and the almond shells and whatever else it is. I mean, there's no ag industry in California that is not connected and dependent on dairy in some way. So it's critical that dairy continues in California and that we come together and unite as an industry to face the incredibly complicated future that we have as an ag industry, and particularly as dairy. Things like milk substitutes and Sigma and minimum wage and overtime and all of these issues I hate to be pessimistic, but if you think about the struggles that we've had, the worst is yet to come. Like the most difficult decisions that we're going to make as farmers are in our future. But I do believe that just beyond that future, there's a lot of hope. I think that a lot of the problems that we're being blamed for in agriculture in terms of climate change and pollution and whatnot, the tide is going to turn, and then we're going to be viewed as the solution to those problems. And I think we're just about to hit a tipping point in terms of, that as a possibility. So it's important that this process happens and that it brings, the industry together. We are now in phase 2 of this process. I just want to walk you quickly through where we're going from here, and then I'll give you more information and some more detail about the next steps at the end of the day. So right now we are in the feedback mode. The reason why we ended up delaying the timeline is because we received so much input from the phase 1, from the think tank phase, from you guys, that it kind of overwhelmed us. We kind of, I guess, we misjudged how long it would take to deal with the amount of information that we were given. And what came out of this is basically 11 different ideas. And so we had to give it the time it needed to present something to you that is useful. And so today in the producer feedback phase, which we called the Shark Tank, but we couldn't use Shark Tank because Land O'Lakes was going to sue us or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. But today is the opportunity now for you guys to try to understand and provide feedback and input to these ideas. And it's important to understand as you're looking at these ideas that these ideas are not to be, number one, not to be considered the opinion of Marin and Matt to some degree. They're not the opinion of the co-ops. They're not the opinion of the Stop Quip guys or the dairy families. They are a reflection of what came to Marin and Matt from the feedback from the first phase, okay? So this is what you guys provided. The second thing to understand about these proposals is that they are not whole and complete as ideas. They are kind of in silos right now, like here's an idea, and here's an idea, but they're not to be judged as that this is a final idea. And what we're looking for is input on these ideas in order to further those ideas and make them better. In which case, it's very possible that ideas can be combined. That what you see here say, well, this is a good idea from document A, and this is a good idea from document B, and if we put those together, it would make a good plan. So these are the kind of things that we want you to be thinking about today while we're going through the process. So then we're going to go into, once we have these meetings complete, there's going to be some regional meetings over the next 2 weeks where people can get into smaller groups and look at this information in more depth, because today is sort of the introduction of these ideas. We want you to be able to kind of workshop them and provide more feedback to Marin and Matt. And then around the 1st of December, they're going to have been delivered all the feedback that we're going to get. And by the middle of January, we're going to be back in these rooms doing this again with the final 3 with the next stage, which is getting these 9 or 11 ideas down to 3. And then, and then we're going to do this same kind of format again, and we're going to get it to 1. And by the middle of February, by the farm show, we say, by the farm show, we're going to have one idea, one thing that we believe we can all go through together. And that idea is going to have come out of all of your participation and all of your feedback. And we are committed to the fact that this is a collaboration. There's not going to be any block voting. There's not going to be any backroom, conversations. This is all out there. It's all transparent. It's all out in the open. So we appreciate you participating with us today. Your participation in this really makes a difference to the process. So with that, thank you very much. Oh, and one other quick thing. Craig brought up the idea that there are 2 possibilities for a petition. And it's a pretty complicated and a little bit confusing subject. So that is the reason why we brought Don Schipelhood in today, to explain what the statute says so that you guys can understand it and judge for yourself what these things mean, okay? That's why Don's here today, and so I hope that you guys give Don your attention and give him, a show of respect and support through his description. So with that, I'll bring Marin up. Thank you.
All right, welcome back. So a little bit on the agenda. Part 1, Don Schipelhood. He's going to present for about 20-25 minutes. Then we're going to have extensive Q&A. If you have a question, you'll be able to write it down, pass it on to Matt. They will give the questions to me, and I will be doing the interview with Don here at the stage. We did it last 2 meetings, worked very well. I don't always repeat the same questions. All of the Q&As from all 3 meetings will be online next week. After that, we'll have a break, and then we'll move into analyzing the options. We'll have 3 sessions. In the first session, 3 ideas on preserving QIP. In the next session, 3 ideas on buying out quota, compensating quota holders. In the third session, a termination and the sunset options there. 11 ideas altogether. It ran for about 3 hours in Chino, 3 hours, 30 minutes in Tulare. We're going to try to keep it up to 3 hours, 10 minutes here today. Our first speaker today is Don Schipelhood, who is the branch chief for dairy marketing branch at CDFA. He is the administrator of QIP. When the secretary needs to understand the statute, she turns to her general counsel and Donald Schipelhood. So there's no better person to explain to us the various legal pathways and constraints regarding the petitions to terminate QIP than Donald. And Donald is going deer hunting this weekend, so he wants to be very efficient today with his presentation, but also make sure that he answers all of your questions. Donald, the floor is yours. I'm going to set up your slides.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come down. It's been an interesting couple of meetings. Good turnout today, good turnout yesterday. Southern California, I think we probably had about 100% participation of dairy farms in the area and had all 30 producers there. So definitely, it's interesting to me. When I started with the department 30 years ago, over 30% of the milk in the state was still coming out of that Chino milk shed. Definitely a much different picture as I drove around that area yesterday or Wednesday, I guess. Thank you. So as Marin said, my role or purpose for coming here today is to explain the 2 different paths that a petition process could go down. The reason there's 2 different paths is that there are multiple chapters in the Food and Ag Code where milk law is put in place. There's Chapter 1, which deals mostly with paying for manufacturing milk. We won't talk about that today. Chapter 2, which had to do with establishing prices for market milk. That was the chapter that gave us authority to have the stabilization and marketing plans. Those have been replaced by the federal market order. Chapter 2.5 or 2.5 deals with the Milk Producer Security Trust Fund insurance program to protect you, the producer, from non-payment by handlers. Chapter 3, which is the original Milk Pooling Act that allowed for the pooling of milk revenue here in California and the issuance of quota. And lastly, Chapter 3.5. Chapter 3.5 was added late in the game, relatively speaking. It was added in 1993. It established the $1.70 spread between the quota price and the non-quota price. And so those two chapters, last two chapters, Chapter 3, which again is where quota was issued, established the original pooling plan, and 3.5, which gave the department the direction to have the $1.70 spread. Those two chapters are what I'm going to focus on today. Both of those chapters have language in them that describe and allow for a petition process and a hearing process and possibly a referendum to take place. Again, as was mentioned earlier, it's kind of confusing, but that's the way the law was written. So we have two different chapters. I'm going to dive right in. Those of you that endured the first presentation I gave in Southern California, you got to enjoy me reading code. I'm not going to do that today out of the trying to be mindful of time. But in Chapter 3.0, the code section I just had up, and this code section are the code sections that talk about the petition process, hearing process, referendum process. Here's some additional part of that last code section. Pretty lengthy code section. I'm not going to try and take it all on in one bite. Break it down here a little bit. So this is the same code sections I had on the last two slides, but just pulled out select portions of that code section. So what I want to point out is in Chapter 3, the secretary may amend a plan, but she can only amend that plan after a public hearing. So the public hearing is a crucial part of the process. So how do we get to a hearing? There's a couple different ways we can get to a hearing. The director may have a hearing on her own motion. So that's down here. The hearing may be held on her own motion, so that the secretary at any point could say, hey, I'm going to hold a hearing on this QIP plan, and we're going to listen to you, the industry, interested parties, hear their testimony, and decide what to do with the plan based on that testimony. A petition can be held by any one individual interested party, sending a petition or a recommendation or a request to the director saying, hey, I think that we need to have a hearing and here's why. She could accept that and say, yeah, good idea, we'll have that. Or she shall call a public hearing if she receives a petition that is signed by not less than 25% of the total producers that produce not less than 25% of the total production of all milk in the state. And so Craig was up here earlier talking about their efforts to get the petition circulated and signed, and so that's a threshold that they are trying to meet in gathering those signatures. So if we get those signatures in, we go to a hearing based on that public hearing. At this point, based on what we have here in the language, what can the secretary do? Well, she can decide not going to do anything at all because things are going just fine based on the testimony. She can terminate the QIP, and in here it talks about the director may terminate the plan and talks about some thresholds or things that she has to decide in order to do that. She can amend the plan, so she can make non-substantive amendments if she wants to without going to a referendum. So here, after the hearing, the director may make non-substantive amendments. She doesn't have to go to a referendum. If she wanted to make substantive amendments, we would, under this authority, have to put that out to a referendum of you, the producers. So that's all well and good at this point, right? We get that 25%, we have to go to a hearing. The legislature was pretty clear at what we have to do. If we get that 25%, not only do we have to go to a hearing, the language also says if you get that 25%, we have to go to referendum. So The director shall submit the termination of the plan to a statewide referendum. Again, we'd still have to go through the hearing, but we would have to, again, there's that shall word, shall submit the plan for termination upon receipt of a petition requesting termination by 25% of the total number of producers and 25% of the milk. So 3.0, get that petition, 25%, have to go to a hearing, also have to go to a referendum. Another thing, important distinction of Chapter 3.0, again, we're still talking about Chapter 3.0, is the vote count. If we had a referendum, the code tells us what basically the petition has to ask. Do you want to continue this or do you want to terminate? And so 3 things have to happen. First, at least 51% of producers have to submit a petition to us. Those petitions not a petition, a ballot. We would mail ballots out to you, the producer. It would say, here's your producer number, your name, address, here's your milk volume that was reported to us, and here's who reported it to us. So based on that volume, on that ballot, you check yes or no, sign it, send it back in. We start tabulating. We have to receive at least 51% of those ballots back, and one of 2 things has to happen down here. 65% of those voting have to vote yes, and those 65 have to produce at least 51% of the milk that was represented in that vote. Or, if you don't have 65% of the number of producers, if you only had 51% of the number of producers, and those 51% produce 65% of the milk in the vote, then the ballot would pass. So this is what we often refer to as a supermajority. That type of vote is used very often in the marketing orders. One thing I didn't touch on earlier is that important distinction, we're not part of the Marketing Act. That we've been mistakenly thought to be a part of a marketing order. We're not. It's a separate standalone legislation. The important part, though, coming out of 3 is this vote count. You have to have the supermajority, and we would be required to go to referendum if we had that 25%. The next chapter, Chapter 3.5, Chapter 3.5 initially was put in place to establish the $1.70 spread. The legislature put that chapter in 93 and said, Department, you will announce a $1.70 spread between the quota price and the overbase price when you announce those pool prices, and you're going to do it until the producers no longer want you to do that. And so in that chapter, there's language again that says that, and I'll get to the next slide. But next important thing is the language that was added to the Food and Ag Code that gave us the authority to have the standalone quota program, Food and Ag Code Section 62757, was added into Chapter 3.5. Again, initially put in place for the $1.70 spread. When it was put in place, the legislature said, well, here's a process you have to go through to establish the QIP. If you're going to establish it, go to the Producer Review Board, talk to the review board about how this program should look. If you're going to implement it, put it to a vote of the producers. And it said, we're going to point back to Chapter 3.0. So when we implemented the QIP, per the legislator's direction, we used that supermajority vote when we were tabulating the QIP. Again, staying in 3.5, what was also included in 3.5, as I mentioned earlier, was language that says that this chapter will remain operative until the Secretary certifies that the producers have voted in a referendum to suspend the operation. So the legislature envisioned a time when you, the producer community, may want to suspend Chapter 3.5. And the legislature gave us direction, said that the Secretary may, again, there's that term, may versus shall, may hold a public hearing at any time to consider whether this chapter shall be suspended So again, she can do it at any time based on her own motion. Any one interested party sends a letter in and says, hey, we want to have a hearing. She says, great idea, we're going to do that. Or she shall hold a public hearing to review a petition. So there's that shall word telling us we have to do it if we get a petition signed by not less than 25% of producers who produce not less than 25% of the total milk. And so this is what Craig is referencing, that they're shifting their focus and using the authority here to try and get that 25% to require that hearing. So the next important distinction between Chapter 3 and 3.5 is that in 3, you may recall, I hit the next slide that said, if you get that 25%, you have to go to referendum. That language doesn't exist in Chapter 3.5. The only thing that 3.5 requires us to do is to hold that hearing, but then it does talk about the referendum. So it doesn't say you have to go to referendum, but you do have to hold a hearing. The secretary shall, if we go to a hearing, the secretary shall establish a 60-day period to hold that referendum, and she can extend that for an additional 30 days. So basically, if we weren't getting enough votes in place and the secretary wanted to allow more time for votes to come in, she could extend that voting process. So the legislature, again, they kind of tell us how we have to do things. The ballot, if we go to a referendum, is going to look basically like this. As I mentioned earlier, we would send this ballot out. It would have a statement on there of your total production. We would include it on the ballot we sent out to you, showing how much milk was reported to us and who reported it to us. This is a more interesting section to cover. The vote threshold is much different in Chapter 3.5. So if we've gone to a vote in 3.5, first thing I can start, we'll go to this in a second, but first thing is, what has to happen? Well, in order for the QIP to stay in place, the producer community has to vote to keep it, not to get rid of it. So the ballot would be, do you want to keep Chapter 3.5 in place? The secretary shall find that a vote favorable to continue the operation of this chapter has not been given. The secretary shall so certify to the Secretary of State and shall declare this chapter, again, the entire Chapter 3.5, which includes the authority to have the QIP, would be suspended. So this is where we get the notion or the direction that if you don't vote to keep it, it's gone. What do you have to do to vote to keep it? A few things have to happen with what's required. First, we have to get at least 51% of eligible producers to vote, and that's right up here. Not less than 51% of total eligible producers in the state have voted, and at least 51% of those voting have to vote yes, and of those voting yes, they have to produce at least 51% of the milk included in that vote tabulation. So again, to keep it, you have to vote to keep it. You have to have 51% of producers eligible, participating in the vote, at least 51% of those voting yes, and they have to produce at least 51% of the milk. Much different than the supermajority vote that is spelled out in Chapter 3.0. If the chapter does not continue, then what happens, the legislature said, if it doesn't continue, then we revert back to the pool plan that was in place December 31, 1993. The calculation of the pool in 1993 was driven entirely by class prices. It doesn't talk about that 19.5-cent additional price or additional revenue to quota producers. It just talks about how we're going to divvy up those class prices in the pool. Without any class prices being announced by the department, we really wouldn't have any way of calculating a quota price or any kind of a pool price. And that's it. So the takeaway But I came down to discuss, again, two different authorities. Chapter 3.0 requires a supermajority. It also ties our hands as a department and requires us not only to go to a referendum, or excuse me, a hearing, but a referendum if we get those 25%. And that's in contrast to 3.5, which only requires us to go to a hearing, but if we do go to a referendum, then the lower threshold of the 51%. And with that, we'll do our Q&A session.
We actually have two microphones working well this morning. And I understand that the camera only captures between these two tables there. So Don, if we can...
No, you stand there, I'll stand here.
Okay. All right. So I guess we'll do this standing up this time. Stand-up comedy. So these little Post-it notes or note cards, if you have them, and if you have a question, please write the question. Please write very neatly. I didn't ask some questions yesterday because I couldn't read them. So I would like to be able to read your question. And then pass them off to Matt. They will pass them off to me, and then I'll be asking the questions here. Donald, can you walk us through the timeline? So let me give you this scenario. Let's say that it's the farm show next year, February 15th. And let's say that we went through this process and we were not able to reach a consensus. And just as a thought experiment, let's assume that on February 15th, 2020, the Stop Quip files the petition under Chapter 3, the 65% petition, right? If you could walk with me through the timeline, what happens first, how long does it approximately take? So I assume that the very first step after the petition is received on February 15th next year would be to validate the signatures, right?
That's correct.
Could you spend just a few sentences talking about the process of validating the signatures?
So when we get the petition in, we look at the list of producers that we have in the milk pooling database, and we will also cross-reference that with a list of dairy producers that we have in the milk and dairy food safety, so the folks that issue the grade A permits. And I'll look at the names that we have in the two of those, make sure that that we're both on the same page as far as grade A producers in the state. Once I get those two lists reconciled, then start comparing the signatures and names that we have or that I received on those petitions to those lists that we have both in, again, milk and dairy food safety and in milk pooling or the QUIP program. When I'm looking at the signatures for a dairy farm that owns quota, I go straight to the producer's folder and look to see who is registered as the owner of the dairy. The law requires that whoever owns a dairy, the quota has to be registered in the name of the producer, same people that own the dairy. And so if your dairy has quota assigned to it, I will use that quota certificate and the quota registration as my control, if you will, for the signatures that we accept. For the dairy farms that don't have quota, we have the list of names that usually the handler will submit to us saying, hey, we got a new dairy farm starting. This is the list that we have as the owners. And then milk and dairy food safety, they usually have the same names. So I'll look at the names that we have from those two sources and use those names as well. So that's, from there, once I get that, then.
And how long could that process take? Just your best guess. We won't hold you to it.
So that process actually was the lengthier part of the process the last time around because we hadn't spent as much time reconciling the list between milk and dairy foods and ourselves. And so for me going through that took me 2 to 3 weeks just to get through that. It's a very cumbersome process to going through manually and comparing and contrasting. So, but what I have done since then is I've been keeping track of the changes that we've received. So it wouldn't be as lengthy a process, but still, at least 30 days to get through that.
So now we are in March 15th, and for the sake of the thought experiment, let's assume that there, even if some signatures are discarded, there's enough signatures, there's a 25% threshold is met. And again, a reminder, we are under Chapter 3, right? So we are now March 15th. What is the next action that the Secretary of the CDFA would take at March 15th? Then?
So the secretary would have to, at that point, call for a hearing. It doesn't really say what kind of a time frame you have to have. It would be public hearing process. We'd have to give, per law, an Open Meeting Act, we have to give at least 10 days notice. But most likely we'd give a little more lead time just for the logistics of everybody's scheduling and getting a panel in place and getting everything set up. It could be a lengthy process. But
And when you say panel, that is you and someone else from CDFA taking notes, or what does that mean?
That I can't speak to for certain. In the past, when we've had public hearings, it's been departmental staff on those, but I don't know that we're required to have only departmental staff.
Okay.
I know there are hearings at times where you have industry people sit in on those, but yeah, so I'm not sure what our legal restrictions are.
And then, let's say that the meeting were to take place in this room, how is a public hearing different than a meeting that we have here this morning?
Well, so the meeting here obviously is not a legal meeting or not a part of the state government, so you can get together and talk about whatever you want, however you want. You don't have any restrictions. When we have a state meeting, the law requires the Open Meeting Act. We have to put out the agenda, put it out so many days before, and then whatever item is on the agenda, the board that's holding that meeting, they can only take action on those agenda items. They may be able to discuss some other items that are not on the agenda, but they can't take any legal action or formal action on those.
Okay. And then let's assume you would hold, 3, 4, 5 meetings through the state, or?
Well, we wouldn't have to hold hearings, we wouldn't have to hold meetings before a hearing. If we went to a hearing, we would announce a hearing.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
We may have what we historically have called a pre-hearing workshop, where we set something up ahead of time and say, okay, everybody, you want to come in and kind of throw out on the table, here's what I'm going to propose and here's why. You don't necessarily have to participate in that process.
But would hearings take place throughout the state, or is it just in Sacramento?
Usually, we've just done it in Sacramento.
Just in Sacramento?
Yeah.
Okay. And so now we're sometimes in April 2020, right, doing
Yeah.
hearings. Would that be a process that's completed by May 1 or June 1? Help me understand.
Again, there's not a set time frame. Once we call a hearing, then there's like a 60-day to completion process. But it's the upfront part, there may be some flexibility as to when that first hearing or when the hearing is scheduled.
So let's say July 1 would be the end of the hearing. Would that be a reasonable reading of what you said? Okay, and then is there a transcript produced at that?
There is. When we have public hearings, we have a court reporter, and she will record the hearing, and then that transcript is usually available about 10 days later.
So that's okay. So let's say that we're now July 15th. The transcript is done and everything is done. What happens next? And the reason I'm asking openly is because you told us a few minutes ago that there is a restriction in Chapter 3.5 that the Secretary has to call for a referendum. But she has also issued a document where she spells out the process that calls for a PRB meeting, discussion on the. So what happens after July 15th?
So, correction, the 3.0 requires a referendum.
We are still in 3.0, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so 3.0 requires a referendum. Within the QIP itself, there's authority to request a amendment or a change to the QIP. If the request came in under the authority of just the QIP, we would follow the recommended procedures that we have set out
But
in
if
there.
it came from a petition, 3-0 petition, the 65% petition?
We could still go before the board, and we probably would call a board meeting and say, hey, board, here's a petition that came in, discuss, make your recommendation to the secretary, again, very important distinction. The board makes a recommendation to the secretary. Their recommendation is not binding. She can say, thank you very much. You said turn right, we're going left. She has that
But in this
flexibility.
case, she actually has to turn left, right? The Chapter 3 specifies that she has to hold a referendum. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So now we are August 15th, would you say, or September 1, after the consultation with the board is done? And
I would envision that a consultation with the board would probably take place prior to a hearing.
prior to the hearing?
Yeah.
Okay.
You
Okay.
know, this is new ground for us, this whole, once
Yeah.
we have voted out the existing system, went to the federal order, life is different.
Yes, yes, yes. So then maybe sometimes August 1, September 1, we would have a formal call for a referendum issued by the secretary?
I don't think it would be that long.
So maybe even July 15th?
Yeah.
Okay. And that would consist of a ballot being sent to all grade A producers,
So,
or?
yes, if we had a referendum, we would look at who had submitted, no, not who submitted, we'd look at who's had production reported to us by all the handlers in the state. Their production has been reported to us, so we would send a ballot out. Here, whatever your dairy name is, here's your milk production, here's where we have it listed as going to, and then they could send it back. And so we use a ballot that we have sent out. We know it went to the right address that we have on file. has
And
the
that
right
was
production.
90 days last time, or 60 days?
It was initially 60 days, and it was extended another 30 days.
So it was 90,
Yeah.
right?
We had enough signatures at that 60-day time period
Okay.
to implement the QIP, but we still had the additional 30 days. It was
So July 15 to August 15, that's 1 month. September 15, second month. Let's extend it for another 30 days. Now we are on October 15th, closed. The referendum is closed. What happens then?
at that point, then we start counting ballots, and actually we start entering them into a database before the end of the 90 days. So at the end of 90 days, we would allow time for the mail to come in, probably give 10 days for the mail to deliver, and then have a tabulation at that point, and then run it up to the secretary and say, you know, here's the count, here's where we're at, and then make an announcement as soon as we could after that.
So if the referendum is closed on October 15th, would you say November 1 is a reasonable timeline to have the final count prepared for the secretary? And, and when could the dairy community hope to expect that she would issue a final ruling based on the count, or report the count?
So her final ruling would come out when the count came out.
Oh, at the same time.
Yeah.
So, and just for the thought experiment, let's just say that the referendum to terminate QIP did pass. Would the QIP be terminated immediately? Would it be after a few months, or how would that work?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay,
right offhand.
but sometimes before January 1, it would probably
Yeah.
go away, right? So we could potentially find ourselves January 1, 2021, QIP gone. Is that, based on everything that we've gone through, that's a reasonable?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And the reason I go through all of this is because we didn't do this in other two meetings. I think it was useful for you to set the timeline expectations. Now let's do another thought experiment with 3.5. So we'll start with the same February 15th. February 15th, the 3.5 petition comes in. A reminder, that's a petition where only 49.1% of producers need to vote to discontinue Chapter 3.5, and then QIP would be discontinued as well. Correct me if I summarized it incorrectly. So February 15th, the referendum comes in. We go through the same process of validating petition. We are in March 15th, right?
Yep.
And then we do the same public hearing, which takes us to, what did we say before? Was it July 1 through public hearing? And then an interesting thing happens. After the public hearing in the previous petition, the Chapter 3, she would have to go to a referendum, right?
Correct.
What happens here July 1 when the hearing is over under Chapter 3.5?
So she would announce her decision saying, based on the testimony received, here's my decision, here's what we're going to do. And again, it could either be, Chapter 3.5 is functioning the way it should, the way we envisioned it. I don't see any reason to terminate it, so we're just going to keep on keeping on. Or she could say, based on the testimony received, I think it should go to referendum, and then she would establish or tell what the referendum start date was and go from
And
there.
then the
Yeah.
same process. And then I think it's also important to understand that if we do go to a referendum, what happens if everybody stays home? Not a single ballot is submitted.
Nothing would change.
Nothing would change on the
I'm
3.5?
sorry, under 3.5, if she said we're going to a referendum, she's at that point saying, okay, the producers sound like they don't want this. The way the law is written, you have to vote to keep it at that point.
Right.
And so if nobody shows up, then that entire chapter 3.5 would be suspended,
Including QUIP.
including the authority for QUIP, yes.
So under Chapter 3, 65%, we have to go to a referendum, everybody stays home, nothing changes, right?
Correct.
Under Chapter 3.5, we don't have to go to a referendum, it's up to the Secretary Ross, but if we do go to a referendum, if people don't vote, the QUIP could actually go away, with 0 votes, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. All right, so a lot of questions that we've received here in the first batch that I was reading while Don was explaining this asked whether the secretary has to go to a referendum. It depends on the type of the petition submitted. The 65%, you have to go to a referendum. The 51%, it's up to the discretion of the secretary. And I hope the timeline here helps that, one way or another, by the summer or late summer 2020, you would know whether you're in a referendum or not. If the February 15th is the farm show is the sort of the cutoff for consensus or no consensus. Appreciate that. There was a question that was asked before we had the federal order. How was quota paid for back then? Was it paid by the producers or the processors?
It was paid by the processors. The entire pool revenue that we redistributed through our program, through the pooling program, that was all minimum price monies that were paid by the processors to the producers. So it's your money as producers in one kitty. All we did was redistribute that money based on how much quota you had, how much base over base.
Okay, but if we had a referendum to discontinue quota but keep the state order, is it correct or not correct that some producers would see their prices increased if the quota went away?
I'm sorry.
Let's say that we're in a state order, but we just
if we were in a state
discontinue
order,
quota,
okay.
would some producers see their prices go up?
If quota would have been eliminated under the federal system,
Under the state system?
under the state system, the overbase price would have gone up about close to 40 cents a hundredweight.
That's exactly the point of that question. So the question was, how was quota paid for? Who paid for quota before the federal milk market order? Don just answered it was not us as producers, it was in fact processors.
Yeah, and if the quota was discontinued, some producers would see the higher prices.
That wasn't part of my question.
That was my question, actually. Yes. Okay. So, that's right here. A lot of questions that we've received are outside the authority of Don and his administrative powers, so I'm going to skip it here. And I guess there was one question, Don, that is legitimate. Oh,
We have a petition, you're saying it's not required, which I disagree with you on that, that's all right. If we have 300 people come in to the hearing or sign the petition, desires to have the industry decide the question, what do you think her reaction
I'm not going to speculate on that, Craig. But she has, as I've mentioned before, she has been very much interested in you as a producer community to decide your own direction, your own, whether you go to a federal order or not, and decide your own fate. Yeah, I'm not going to speculate what she would decide. You heard the discussion or the comments of Michelle Diaz at a prior meeting. You know, she's interacted with the secretary quite often, and so I think that you've heard her speculation. I'm not going to speculate.
So we will have another webinar on Monday morning. Some of the questions that were asked here today, I will take these cards with me and we will prepare them for our Q&A on Monday morning. So the interest of time and efficiency,
I think there's an important question that came over here, and I think we got a confusing answer. So I think we need to clarify here.
Okay.
The question was who was paying for the quota program under the state system, and technically your answer was the processors pay into the pool, that money's then distributed based on quota or non-quota.
Yeah.
But processors did not pay a higher price in order to solely fund the quota program. They paid the class 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on which class they were buying. It was the producers that then agreed to a quota program that distributed some of the money to the quota holders and the remaining to the overbase. And to Marin's point, if there was no quota program, it would not have lowered the processors' obligations to the pool. They would have paid exactly the same amount into the pool. It just would have been spread evenly over the overbase. So my question is, did I say anything inaccurate here?
No, and so if you go back to the original pool payout where we had a variable spread, the quota producer, the first pools, all the class 1 price went only to quota producers. And so that was kind of the political trade-off to get anybody that owned quota to go into and be in favor of a pooling system. And so at the onset, class $1 only went to to quota producers. When we went to the $1.70 spread, the class 1 price was enhanced. Everybody benefited under that $1.70 spread because there was more money thrown in the pool with the $1.70 spread. That enhanced class 1 revenue got shared amongst everybody, as opposed to the old system where class 1 monies only went to quota milk. So you all across the board benefited for a number of years. Overbase producers for a lot of years were much better off with the $1.70 spread system than it would have been under the variable spread. It wasn't until we, as a department, enhanced the weigh factor value in the formulas that you started to see that had we had the old system in place versus what we had in $1.70, the overbase producers would have had a little bit more money. As we adjusted class 1 price up and down, 4B price up and down, it changed that dynamic as to what way that money would have flowed. But it was all class price revenue paid by processors into the pool and then redistributed based on quota base and overbase.
I'm going to ask you, Stephanie, to speak with Don in the break. On a side, we are at 11 o'clock. Don and I will continue, Don and I will continue this conversation on Monday morning. We have another 2 hours to go through. We have 11 proposals to go to. You guys have a weekend to go to after this. So let's thank Don for his participation here this morning. We'll take a short 10-minute break, and then we will continue with the proposals.
I like yours when you go up. I like yours. The economist answer.
it's a short Q&A, but you know, if you go with your question with either now if you want or after the meeting, I will just ask that. Okay. Does that work for you? Yeah. So, do you want to show me your question?
I had a question about Secretary Ennis' instructions to change something. It looks like to me you can file it under resistance.
But no, but let's make sure that people ask.
They don't give enough people secretaries to make it a change that without a referendum it wasn't deemed to be subsidized. What's the definition of subsidized?
Oh, so I can answer you that one. If you're not pleased with my answer, you can consult with any attorney. I'm sure you cannot change the statute to be you can change the implementing regulation. So because SQUIP is an implementing regulation authorized under the statute, you can change that. It's confusing. Right? The only way to suspend 3.5 rate, to make 3.5 go away, would be to have your bill passed in the legislature. Does that make sense?
So there could be the amendment to the terms of what a majority or so is without the legislation.
That is correct. Because the legislature put so wherever the legislature gave discretion is something that you can amend. But where the legislature stipulated the conditions, that is, that is something that you But it didn't mean to disregard the question.
Yeah, we understand there's kind of on the table. It seemed like
I hope this is.
yeah. Well, I mean, we've already just my question.
If there's another question that we can still pass it now, don't stop.
Just the sense of what your question answered. We need to shut down.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Bypass the means of
It was a little bit. It's not funny, I missed you. How are you? Yeah, see you.
Didn't mean to get on your feet there, but
But you did.
I know. Well, you need it. That's not good, right?
No, I believe that.
How's the baby?
Good, good. Boy, it's going to be 2 months from now.
It's been softening mine up. It's pretty cool to see.
No, like that.
We'll see you next year.
Yeah, I know.
Are you looking for expected?
They're expecting to expect. All good. Well, no, I have a stepson that I adopted. So he's also my son.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
He's a 12-year-old. So I'll put a teenager and infant. Can't beat that. I'm glad you made it today. I really
Yeah,
mean
me
that.
too.
We were sort of at a Luma meeting, but maybe this way we have a good audience. There's another thing I want to ask you. In the phase 3, we will be asked to analyze even further the implications without having some financial records of the dairies in Petaluma. There's very little that we can say on what will happen.
I really do myself. I really easy to get.
So when I was open polls, they no longer, yeah, they no longer have it. For all the dairies in Petaluma, or individual records, just anonymized? You mean cost of production or? If you want to move right, then to the Luma.
There you are. Did you make it too?
If you believe that it's unfair to the final right-up to stay that in Petaluma more producers potentially critically defend for payments, then I need to get some sort of financial statements to corroborate it. They will give us individual producers on breakdown.
No, I imagine they would. They could give you. They could give you financial. I'm not going to give you my personal stuff.
Okay, okay.
Just his personal is not going to give you.
Okay, no, I understand that.
Even if anecdotally it seems correct,
We would actually need it like for a whole.
They might be able to do stuff that way as well. Did you guys take a call?
Yeah, yeah.
all right. Honestly, there was a lot of good questions.
I did ask them. I'm not actually embedded a lot.
How did nobody know about this section 3.5 million?
That's a fair one.
Is there a period of time when the secretary allocates
That's what I also did.
a letter is sent to the secretary?
Keep it informed.
Can you, but it does do a good example of showing that it's under pressure. Can you clarify why the two voting processes are so different? Why is it more stringent? 3.5 is voted out, pricing goes to 3, how do you calculate?
All right, we'll ask some of those questions. Okay, if you could please go back to your seats. We will now continue with the program. If you could please take your seat, we will now continue with the program.
Cold?
What was that?
One of the things that Dinos asked me.
Okay, we need to continue with the meeting now. Everybody should have a feedback booklet. This is very critical. This is the way in which your vote counts as part of this process. We are now at 11 ideas. By December 1, we will be down to only 3 ideas. What you write in this feedback booklet will help determine which ideas die and which ideas go to live until and be considered in further depth in phase 3. So if you consider the feedback booklet, on the front page, we are asking you whether you're a grade A milk producer. On the second page, if you take just a moment to take a look there, we're asking you just some basic demographics about yourself. There's nothing academic about it. We need to understand whether there are some ideas that are acceptable across the spectrum, whether you have 100 cows or 3,000 cows, whether you have 0 quota or 80% quota. So that's why we are asking you these questions. Please take a moment to answer these questions on page 1. As you do that, I will just take a moment to I'll just take a moment to remind you of what our charge is and what our charge is not. In phase 1, we met with you here today. We held a number of phone calls, one-on-one consultations to gather inputs, to gather ideas. Every single idea that we will present here today came from you in one shape or form. It came from you. We maybe fine-tuned it, gave it enough detail to be considered, but these are all your ideas. We are now in phase 2. In phase 2, we wrote up what we heard from you, and we are here to present options. We have 11 options. I would be disappointed if some of those options don't produce outrage in you. We have to give you an options from a far right to far left, all across the spectrum. And it is up to you now to express your preferences by writing on the feedback booklet whether you strongly disagree with some idea or strongly agree with some idea. We will have 3 Q&A blocks. We will present 3 ideas, then we'll have a discussion. Please use the discussion to learn more about the proposal. I will do pretty heavy moderating just to make sure that we are done by just after 1 o'clock this afternoon. Just in your interest, in interest of everybody's time, we will use the Q&A to clarify something about these proposals that may not be as clear. When we go to phase 3, we will be down to 3 options only, and then our job will be to spell out what the consequences will be of implementing any one of them, and to add more details, how would you actually go about doing them. At no point do Matt and I advocate for quota holders or quota payers or anything like that. We don't own quota, we cannot own quota, we are not paid by one side or another. We are here to moderate the process. Please keep that in mind. If we present an idea that provokes strong emotions, please channel those emotions to the feedback booklet. That way they will influence the selection process. Also, Dino said that one of the reasons why we are a little bit delayed is because we received a lot of feedback. I also want to apologize personally. I'm the one to blame for a delay of at least a few weeks. This happened on September 9th. So I'm a father now. But my promise to you, thank you. My promise to you is my wife is not pregnant again. I have nobody on a side as well, so there won't be another baby in January, right? Now we are back on track. Here's what we heard from you. 40,000 distinct words were on those 1,500 note cards that you sent to us or that we collected in the phase 1 meetings. Some words that stand out, of course, quota. Here's a buyout, holders, value, sunset, assessments, years, etc. So a lot of thought went into this process. We are very grateful and we are humbled to be a part of this process to elicit your feedback. We are now moving from brainstorming into narrowing down the options, building towards a hope for consensus. So before we go into individual proposals, I want to just spend 2 slides talking about what we believe, Matt and I, what we believe is are prerequisites for a consensus. First, we have to go through this process of 11 down to 3 down to 1. But even when we get down to 1, not all details will be completely spelled out. You cannot do that through 15 different surveys. At some point where you get close enough to the end, when you provide close enough directions through the surveys and inclusive process, you will have to empower leaders with with authority to negotiate on your behalf and then bring back the final solutions with all the full details. You will have to have protocols for legitimizing the negotiated solution, around the farm show date. There has to be some mutually recognized credible deadline. Dino just offered middle of February. I actually do think that's reasonable. I know there's a lot of impatience to get it done sooner. If there is an appetite to go faster, Matt and I will do our absolute best to deliver the final write-up from our side as soon as humanly possible. We will be happy to meet with you here a day after New Year's if you want, or before. And then finally, you have to have substantially similar assessments of risk. If there is one side of the room that believes that alternative to not having a consensus is that business stays just as it always has been, that the 3-5 petition will not be honored, that 3-0 petition will not pass, we have a majority, then why negotiate, right? So I implore you to study these pathways. Put yourself in the shoes of the opposing side. Think what you would do if you were on the other side. That way you will understand the risks and it will bring you closer to the consensus. And then finally, whatever consensus we find has to be legally feasible and has to be agreeable to CDFA. CDFA will be our partner in implementing that solution in the end. A reminder of the magnitude of risk. This is a 65% threshold. These are mixed milk solids in the state, grade A. This is the 65% threshold. This is the 49.1% threshold. We don't know exactly how people will vote. We can make an educated guess based on the data that was shared with us from CDFA. If everybody voted just their narrow cash flow interests, not looking at a broader community, what you would find is that over the last 10 years, in most of the years, there likely would be enough votes to pass the 65% referendum. In 2018, because the milk production in California was shrinking a little bit, it was more dubious whether that referendum would pass. As milk production grows, because quota pounds don't grow, it is more and more likely that 65% referendum would pass. So that's a real threat. I'm not saying that it will pass. I'm just saying that it has it's high enough threat to take it seriously when you're negotiating. You've heard Don today this morning. If there is a petition for 65%, they have to go to a referendum. The Secretary does not have that discretion. But it's not certain that the referendum would pass. Now, if the petition is filed for the 51%, the 3.5 chapter petition, that is the threshold that is much lower than the uncertainty about the votes. Votes will very likely be there for that referendum to fail to reauthorize or to continue to authorize Chapter 3.5. The big risk there is whether the Secretary would move to a referendum or not. And it's a true uncertainty in my mind. Some of you may think that there is zero chance that the Secretary would do that. Others may say, well, of course she will have to do that. How could she possibly not do that? I think that there is a genuine uncertainty there. So again, you should use this. I'm putting this slide here not to scare you, but to encourage you to seek a genuine consensus with a person that may have different financial interests than you. Revisiting the past will not help us get there. So I will stay strictly focused on 11 ideas that look into the future over the next hour and a half. And here's the first proposal, and Matt is going to take us through this proposal. This proposal is on page 3 of your booklet. We just changed the order a little bit. So if you skip page 2 just for a moment, we'll get back to that in a second, and go to page 3, document K, regional quota adjusters.
Thanks, Martin. Can you guys hear me okay in the back? We okay? All right, so the way that this next phase of meetings goes is it's going to be much more like a workshop. And so Martin and I are going to take turns presenting a proposal on how you could either keep or buy out or dissolve the quota system. And so what's going to happen is we're going to discuss 3 ideas. At the end of discussing 3 ideas, we're going to have open it up for questions. After each idea, we're going to take time and ask you guys to fill out these papers in front of you. And it's the feedback on these papers that is going to inform the entire process and ultimately help us trim down from 10 ideas to 3. So the first proposal that we have is there. I believe it's on page 3, and is document K, changing regional quota adjusters. If you guys would like to read the write-up on changing regional quota adjusters or any of the other ideas, they're online on the Dairy Family's website. And Maren, is the link to do the survey online? Yeah, there's also, in addition to this, if you guys have friends at home, know other producers that wanted to come and couldn't make it, there's a survey online that they can fill out, which looks exactly like the papers that you have in front of you. So the first proposal is to change regional quota adjusters. So the way that regional quota adjusters are set up, known as RQAs, is that depending on where you are in the state, you get paid a different amount of money for owning quota. If you're in Southern California and you own quota, it works out to about $1.70 a hundredweight. And if you're in, say, Tulare, it'd be $1.43. So this proposal is to change that. And there's two reasons why that we're starting with this proposal. The first, of course, is as a standalone idea. But what you'll find as we go forward is that we can utilize the fact that you're allowed to change RQAs via a referendum process to implement a whole slew of different solutions. So we're starting with this idea because it's going to be relevant as we go forward. But just strictly talking about regional quota adjusters, okay, so you get paid more for quota in Southern California than you do in, say, the Central Valley. You get paid more in Northern California than the Central Valley. This was originally implemented to give milk a regional valuation. Milk that was near population centers got valued more via the quota system. When we went into the federal order, we got Class 1 differentials, which also value milk regionally. And so this was one of the most popular ideas from the Phase 1 meetings, is that, well, perhaps this is now redundant. We now have two systems valuing milk regionally. And so the first proposal is to change regional quota adjusters. If you were to change the regional quota adjusters to the $1.43 level, it would reduce total assessments by about 3 cents a hundredweight. And that's the first proposal. So thank you. Please now turn to your papers and fill out the survey, and Maren will walk through the survey.
Thank you, Matt. On page 3, on the top of the page, there are 3 bullet points that summarize the proposal. For every proposal that we present to you, we will have a short summary in the booklet as well so that you can read at your own pace. We will always ask you the same questions. In your opinion, is this proposal fair? If you believe that it is fair, put strongly agree. If you don't believe it is fair, put strongly disagree. If you're sort of mixed mind, you can put something in the middle. Is it easy to understand? If you are finding it personally easy to understand, put strongly agree. If you are finding it difficult to understand, put strongly disagree. And then finally, if this was the proposed solution to the quota crisis, would you vote for it on a referendum? We are also asking you open-ended questions. What do you like about the proposal? How can it be made better? And if you have any other comments, to enter there as well. So I'm going to give you now a minute or two just to enter your feedback on document K, and then we will proceed with document I. The Q&A will be after we have completed 3 proposals. Okay, in the interest of time, I will move on. This is the document I, page 2, in your feedback booklet. We're calling it Tying Quota Payments to Class 1 Sales. As part of the analysis that Matt and I did, we looked at what is likely to happen over the next 10 years in the state. And in particular with fluid milk sales, what we find is that since the turn of the century, the per capita consumption has been declining, but it has been largely offset by a growth in population. California is growing, number of people in California is growing. However, sometimes at the turn of this decade, 2010, 2011, the reduction in the per capita consumption became more accelerated and the population growth slowed down. As a result, the total fluid milk sales started going down. We anticipate they will continue to go down about 2% a year. By 2030, the fluid milk sales in California will be about 23% lower than they are today. Now, quota was never just about Class 1, but it was always strongly motivated by Class 1. And this proposal speaks to that. What we propose is to tie the Class 1 payments closely to the Class 1 sales, pooled, Class 1 milk pooled on California Milk Marketing Order, California Federal Milk Marketing Order. What that would mean in practice is that the quota differential, so the quota pay prices, would be the same throughout the state, and they would go down from an average of $1.54, average for the state, some $1.70, $1.43. They would go down to about $1.08 to $1.10. This would depend on the month as well, if depending on the details. The assessments would be reduced from 37 cents per hundred to 26 cents per hundred. The way that total quota payments would be determined every month, the CDFA would get the bulletin from the Federal Milk Marketing Order. They would look at the total contribution of Class 1 sales to the federal order, and our method, there are multiple methods to calculate it. Our method looks at pooling Class 1 differentials, which is the difference in the Class 1 price versus the opportunity cost of that milk in other classes. And when you do that, you can, when you do it this way, one important thing is that you avoid repeating what happened in the late 80s, early 90s. Some of you may recall that volatility of milk prices at that time were causing, and because it was tied to Class 1 sales back then, to some extent, occasionally you would have a situation that the quota pay was negative in that month. Under this proposal, it would never be negative. It would be slowly declining as the Class 1 sales decline, but it would be very stable from one month to another. And if you want to make it even further stable, you can make a 12-month moving average, for example. But the general principle is to tie the quota payments to Class 1 sales, which would drop the quota pay prices down to about $1.08, $1.10. It would drop the assessments to 26 cents per hundred. We have a table here for you to consider. So how to read this? If we switch to this program today, then after 3 discontinue quota but keep the state order, is it correct or not correct that some producers would see their prices increased if the quota went away?
I'm sorry.
Let's say that we're in a state order, but
if we were in a state
discontinue
order,
quota,
okay.
would some producers see their prices go up?
If quota would have been eliminated under the federal system?
Under the state system.
Under the state system, the overbase price would have gone up about close to 40 cents a hundredweight.
Exactly the point of that question. So the question was, how was quota paid, or who paid for quota before the federal milk market order? Don just answered it was not us as producers, it was in fact processors.
Yeah, and if the quota was discontinued, some producers would see the higher prices.
That wasn't part of my question.
That was my question, actually. Yes. Okay. So. That's right here. A lot of questions that we've received are outside the authority of Don and his administrative powers, so I'm going to skip it here. And I guess there was one question, Don, that is legitimate. Yeah,
We have a petition, you're saying it's not required, which I disagree with you on that, that's all right. We have 300 people come in to the hearing or sign a petition that desires to have the industry decide the question. What do you think her reaction would be to that?
I'm not going to speculate on that, Craig. But she has, as I've mentioned before, she has been very much interested in you as a producer community to decide your own direction, your own, whether you go to a federal order or not, and decide your own fate. I'm not going to speculate what she would decide. You heard the discussion or the comments of Michelle Diaz at a prior meeting. She's interacted with the secretary quite often, and so I think that you've heard her speculation. I'm not going to speculate.
So we will have another webinar on Monday morning. Some of the questions that were asked here today, I will take these cards with me and we will prepare them for our Q&A on Monday morning. So the interest of time and efficiency,
I think there's an important question that came over here, and I think we got a confusing answer. So I think we need to clarify here.
Okay.
The question was who was paying for the quota program under the state system, and technically your answer was the processors pay into the pool, that money's then distributed based on quota or non-quota.
Yeah.
But processors did not pay a higher price in order to solely fund the quota program. They paid the class 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on which class they were buying. It was the producers that then agreed to a quota program that distributed some of the money to the quota holders and the remaining to the overbase. And to Marin's point, if there was no quota program, it would not have lowered the processors' obligations to the pool. They would have paid exactly the same amount into the pool. It just would have been spread evenly over the overbase. So my question is, did I say anything inaccurate here?
No, and so if you go back to the original pool payout where we had a variable spread, the quota producer, the first pools, all the class 1 price went only to quota producers. And so that was kind of the political trade-off to get anybody that owned quota to go into and be in favor of a pooling system. And so at the onset, class $1 only went to to quota producers. When we went to the $1.70 spread, the class 1 price was enhanced. Everybody benefited under that $1.70 spread because there was more money thrown in the pool with the $1.70 spread. That enhanced class 1 revenue got shared amongst everybody, as opposed to the old system where class 1 monies only went to quota milk. So you all across the board benefited for a number of years. Overbase producers for a lot of years were much better off with the $1.70 spread system than it would have been under the variable spread. It wasn't until we, as a department, enhanced the weigh factor value in the formulas that you started to see that had we had the old system in place versus what we had in $1.70, the overbase producers would have had a little bit more money. As we adjusted class 1 price up and down, 4B price up and down, it changed that dynamic as to what way that money would have flowed. But it was all class price revenue paid by processors into the pool and then redistributed based on quota base and overbase.
I'm going to ask you, Stephanie, to speak with Don in the break. On a side, we are at 11 o'clock. Don and I will continue, Don and I will continue this conversation on Monday morning. We have another 2 hours to go through. We have 11 proposals to go to. You guys have a weekend to go to after this. So let's thank Don for his participation here this morning. We'll take a short 10-minute break, and then we will continue with the proposals.
explain, I like Jersey. When it go up, I like Jersey. You give the economist answer, but what is that? It's a short Q&A, but you know, if you go with your question with either now if you want or after the meeting, I mean, should I ask them that work for you?
Yeah.
So, do you want to show me your question?
I had a question about Secretary and his discretion to change something. It looks like the pilot of the
But no, but let's make sure that people ask. Oh, so I can answer you that one. If you're not pleased with my answer, you can consult with any attorney that should. You cannot change the statute you can change the implementing regulation. So because Quick is an implementing regulation authorized under the statute, you can change that. Right? The only way to suspend 3.5 from 8 to make 3.5 go away would be to have a new bill passed in the legislature. Does that make sense?
So there could be the amendment to the terms of what a majority or so of the people is without the legislation.
That is correct. Because the legislature put so wherever the legislature gave discretion is something that you can amend. But when the legislature stipulated the conditions, that is, something that you But it didn't mean to disregard the question of the digital style.
Yeah, we understand there's kind of a frustration at the table. It seems like,
I hope this is.
yeah, well, I mean, regarding this my question.
If there's another question that we can go faster now, don't stop.
Just the sense of wonder question answer. Do we need to shout out?
Oh, yes, yeah.
I passed the means of,
It was a little bit. It's not funny, I missed you. How are you? Yeah, see you.
Didn't mean to get on your feet there, but
Look at that.
I know. Well, you need it. That's my vision, right?
No, I believe that.
How's the baby?
Good, good. Boy, it's going to be 2 months from now.
It's softening mine up. It's pretty cool to see.
No, like that.
We'll see you next year.
Yeah, I know.
They're expecting to expect it. Well, no, I have a stepson that I adopted. He's also my son.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
He's a 12-year-old. So I'll put a teenager and an infant. Can't beat that. I'm glad you made it today. I really
Yeah,
do.
me too.
We were sort of around the Luma meeting, but maybe this way we have a bigger audience. There's another thing I want to ask you. In the phase 3, they will be asked to analyze even further implications without having some financial records of the dairies in Petaluma. There's very little that we can say on what will happen.
I will myself, really easy to get.
So when I was told
They no longer, yeah, they no longer have it. For all the dairies in Petaluma, or individual records, just anonymizable? You mean cost of production or?
years per pound of quota, wherever you are, per pound of quota you will have received $133. Over 6 years, you would receive $259. Over 7 years, you would receive essentially $300. So what is the present value of that? If you would discount that at 5%, over 7 years, it's $254. Over 5 years, it's $193. Over 3 years, is $124. The reason we put these years here, because you may wish to combine this program later with the sunset. So this table also helps you reason through that. But as it is right now, it's proposed as a standalone program, so indefinite existence, preserving quota, so not terminating, not buying out, preserving quota indefinitely, but reducing the quota payments, tying it closer to Class 1 sales. Please, on the page 2, note whether you find this proposal fair or not fair, easy to understand or not easy to understand, and whether you would vote for it if this was the proposal that was put on a referendum. This proposal requires no legislative action. It can be implemented through a referendum. The formal way to do that would be to use regional quota adjusters. RQAs would be made into a formula rather than a constant, and that formula would then transform the legislative mandate into a quota pay price that corresponds to Class 1 sales. So this can be done without legislation. It can be done through a referendum only. And we will open for questions on this proposal after we do one more idea. Yeah, thanks. So, is that yours? Yeah. Okay. All right. Matt is going to take us now through the third idea. This idea in particular has the potential to provoke some strong feelings among some of you. Please channel those opinions into a feedback booklet. That is the best way to influence the process going forward. Matt, the floor is yours.
Okay, this proposal, quota stabilization, document G, our goal with this proposal was to come up with strategies to sustain the quota system without having to go through the legislature and without having to go through referendum. So as we went through, and as you'll find with all these proposals, we wanted to put everything on the table and to give every kind of producer and viewpoint an analysis to go out and try to achieve their specific objectives. With this document, or this analysis, or this proposal, what we identified 2 different methods with which we could try and stabilize the QIP in its current form. The first one is a recognition that the quota program, as it is today, is politically unstable through the referendum process. So Maren covered it earlier. It's we're certainly at risk of exceeding that 65% threshold. And we are definitely exceeding, or maybe definitely isn't quite, with a very high probability exceeding the 49.1% threshold. So the program is politically unstable. To address this issue, we propose creating a quota cooperative. And what the quota co-op would be made up of is quota owners. The way it would get constructed is you'd go around the state getting the quota owners to sign a document that says, well, if we get enough buy-in to participate in the quota co-op goes live. And then for the members of the quota co-op, there would be a fair algorithmic process to decide which quota owners must give up their quota, and then who would get the quota. And so likely at a discounted rate to market prices. And this is all in the hopes of stabilizing the program, which is currently politically unstable. So you would take quota you'd redistribute quota from people who had lots of ownership to those small farmers, who would be sort of the lowest cost individuals to move from having an economic incentive to terminate quota. You try to move them from that basket to the other. Or you would try to take the producers that are currently just barely net payers into the quota system and then move them to being net beneficiaries from the quota system, so that you could change that change the distribution so that 65% was no longer exceeded or at risk of being exceeded. We estimate that if you were trying to redistribute quota, it would cost, well, not cost, but it would take the redistribution of about $90 million worth of quota today in order to be safe from the 65% threshold. And if you wanted to secure the quota system at the 49.1% threshold, our estimate was just under 500 million. So that's probably not feasible at all. So that's the first part. The first strategy is to create a quota co-op to try to move the quota system from a politically unstable place that is today to a politically stable one. The other strategy that we came up with, and we tried investigating what is possible, is trying to increase grade B milk production in the state. So if you can move producers who currently own no quota into the basket, move them to grade B, only grade A producers can vote in the QIP process. And so if you increase the number of grade B, you decrease the number of voters who would want to terminate QIP. You could seek to stabilize QIP through that process. Now, feedback from the industry, this is a wildly unpopular idea, specifically among processors. There's a fear that if you grew grade B milk production in the state, that California would be branded as a unsanitary milk producer. In addition, grade B has downstream effects. So grade B milk cannot be used in grade A products like fluid milk or yogurt. You also can't use, or it causes problems in anyone who makes a grade A claim. So if you have grade A whey, you can't make grade A whey from grade B milk. But so the point of this, to summarize this proposal, we're trying to come up with strategies that would stabilize the QIP without having to engage the legislature and without having to pursue a referendum. What we found was that we could try to redistribute quota because it's politically unstable, and two, we could try to increase the amount of grade B milk production in the state so as to reduce the number of people who wanted to terminate quota. The increasing grade B milk production does have a number of downsides. And if you have more questions about that, we can talk about it in the Q&A process. So before we get to the Q&A, Marin's going to walk through the survey.
Like the previous two proposals, I will now kindly ask you if you could turn to page 4, document G. There's a brief summary of the proposal at the top. And the same questions: is it fair and is it easy to understand? We do not ask you whether you would vote on a referendum here, because this proposal does not require a referendum. It requires quota holders to self-organize. At the end of the process, just around 1 o'clock today, the last page of the booklet, we will ask you to rank all of the ideas that you heard today. It's not possible yet for you to rank them because you haven't heard the rest. But just so you know that that is coming at the end. Okay, we've now gone through 3 proposals, and it's time for a discussion. We want to leave plenty of time for discussion, but also want to be efficient with the meeting. I will entertain questions on these 3 proposals. Anything that is not thematic, we will move on. We will give priority to those that have questions on these 3 proposals. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand. Yes, sir.
On this last one, on the other 2, you made an estimate of what the withholding from our health checks would be. I don't understand on this third one how the money works on that.
Oh, sure. So I will always repeat the question to make sure that everybody heard it. The question from the audience was, how does the money flow in the third proposal in the quota stabilization? So the QIP would stay exactly as it is. There will be no changes to rules. The assessment would be the same. The RQAs would stay the same. Everything would stay the same. The only thing that would change is that some producers that currently own a lot of quota would give up some of that quota in the interest of creating a stable majority of owners so that any referendum would fail if it's submitted. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What would you define as a large quota holder percentage-wise? I mean, are we talking 80 to 100%? Is we talking 70 to 100? What is your estimated, box that you would put that?
Yeah.
Put people in?
Oh, sure. So to be cash flow positive from the program, you would have to own somewhere above 25% of your milk would have to be covered by quota. The higher percent that you have on that, the more financially beneficial the program is to you, right? So this program would call on quota holders to self-organize and develop those rules internally. It is not up to us to tell you, this person should pay should redistribute and this person would not. If you guys as a community decide to push this idea to the phase 3, we would then offer additional details there. At this point, I think it's appropriate to just stay at the level of principle that the higher, if you have 100% of quota, for example, and if you believe that selling some of your quota at a discount that will take you from 100 to a 90%, discontinue quota but keep the state order, is it correct or not correct that some producers would see their prices increased if the quota went away?
I'm sorry.
Let's say that we're in a state order, but
if we were in a state
discontinue
order,
quota,
okay.
would some producers see their prices go up?
If quota would have been eliminated under the federal system?
Under the state system.
Under the state system, the overbase price would have gone up about close to 40 cents a hundredweight.
That wasn't exactly the point of that question. So the question was, how was quota paid for? Who paid for quota before the federal milk market order? John just answered it was not us as producers, it was in fact processors.
Yeah, and if the quota was discontinued, some producers would see the higher prices.
That wasn't part of my question.
That was my question, actually. Yes. Okay. So. That's right here. A lot of questions that we've received are outside the authority of Don and his administrative powers, so I'm going to skip it here. And I guess there was one question, Don, that is legitimate. Oh,
We have a petition, you're saying it's not required, which I disagree with you on that, that's all right. We have 300 people come in to the hearing or sign the petition, desires to have the industry decide the question. What do you think her reaction would be to that?
I'm not going to speculate on that, Craig. But she has, as I've mentioned before, she has been very much interested in you as a producer community to decide your own direction, your own, whether you go to a federal order or not, and decide your own fate. I'm not going to speculate what she would decide. You heard the discussion or the comments of Michelle Diaz at a prior meeting. She's interacted with the secretary quite often, and so I think that you've heard her speculation. I'm not going to speculate.
So we will have another webinar on Monday morning. Some of the questions that were asked here today, I will take these cards with me and we will prepare them for our Q&A on Monday morning. So the interest of time and efficiency,
I think there's an important question that came over here, and I think we got a confusing answer. So I think we need to clarify here.
Okay.
The question was who was paying for the quota program under the state system? And technically, your answer was the processors pay into the pool, that money's then distributed based on quota or non-quota.
Yeah.
But processors did not pay a higher price in order to solely fund the quota program. They paid the class 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on which class they were buying. It was the producers that then agreed to a quota program that distributed some of the money to the quota holders and the remaining to the overbase. And to Marin's point, if there was no quota program, it would not have lowered the processors' obligations to the pool. They would have paid exactly the same amount into the pool. It just would have been spread evenly over the overbase. So my question is, did I say anything inaccurate here?
No, and so if you go back to the original pool payout where we had a variable spread, the quota producer, the first pools, all the class 1 price went only to quota producers. And so that was kind of the political trade-off to get anybody that owned quota to go into and be in favor of a pooling system. And so at the onset, class $1 only went to to quota producers. When we went to the $1.70 spread, the class 1 price was enhanced. Everybody benefited under that $1.70 spread because there was more money thrown in the pool with the $1.70 spread. That enhanced class 1 revenue got shared amongst everybody, as opposed to the old system where class 1 monies only went to quota milk. So you all across the board benefited for a number of years. Overbase producers for a lot of years were much better off with the $1.70 spread system than it would have been under the variable spread. It wasn't until we, as a department, enhanced the weigh factor value in the formulas that you started to see that had we had the old system in place versus what we had in the $1.70, the overbase producers would have had a little bit more money. As we adjusted class 1 price up and down, 4B price up and down, it changed that dynamic as to what way that money would have flowed. But it was all class price revenue paid by processors into the pool and then redistributed based on quota base and overbase.
I'm going to ask you, Stephanie, to speak with Don in the break. On a side, we are at 11 o'clock. Don and I will continue, Don and I will continue this conversation on Monday morning. We have another 2 hours to go through. We have 11 proposals to go to. You guys have a weekend to go to after this. So let's thank Don for his participation here this morning. We'll take a short 10-minute break, and then we will continue with the proposals.
The way that I explain it, I like yours when it go up. I like yours. You give the economist answer. It's a short Q&A, but if you go with your question with me, either now if you want or after the meeting, I'm just going to ask them. Okay. Does it work for you? Yeah. So, do you want to show me your question?
I had a question about Secretary Anderson's strategy to change something. It looks like to me you can file it under resistance.
but let's make sure people ask. Oh, so I can answer you that one. Like, you're not pleased with my answer. You can result in any authority that should be. You cannot change the statute. You can change the implementing regulation. So because quick is an implementing regulation authorized under the statute, we can change that. But the only way to suspend 3.5 rate, to make 3.5 go away, would be to have a new bill passed in the legislature. Does that make sense?
So there could be an amendment to the terms of what a majority or so is without the legislation.
That is correct, because the legislature put so wherever the legislature gave discretion is something that you can amend. But when the legislature stipulated the conditions, that is something that you can. I didn't mean to disregard the question.
Yeah, we understand there's kind of a frustration at the table. It seemed like,
I hope this is.
yeah, well, I mean, regarding this high question.
If there's another question that we can go past it now, don't stop.
Just the sense of what your question answer, do we need to shout out?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Bypass the means of,
It was a little bit. It's not funny, I missed you. How are you? Yeah, see you.
Didn't mean to get on your feet there, but
Look at it.
I know. Well, you need it. That's my business, right?
No, I believe that.
How's the baby?
Good, good. Boy, it's going to be 2 months from now.
It's softening mine up. It's pretty cool to see.
No, it does.
We'll see you next year.
Yeah, I know.
Are you thinking about pregnant?
No, my wife, we just
They're expecting to expect it. All good.
You've got a little girl with her, right?
Well, no, I have a stepson that I adopted, so he's also my son.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
This is closer. So I'll put a teenager and an infant. Can't beat that. I'm glad you made it today. I really
Yeah,
mean
me too.
we were sort of around at a Luma meeting, but maybe this way we have a bigger audience. There's another thing I want to ask you. In the phase 3, they will be asked to analyze even further implications without having some financial records of the dairies in Petaluma. There's very little that we can say on what will happen.
I would myself, really easy to get.
So when I was always been told is that
They no longer, yeah, they no longer have it. For all the dairies in Petaluma, or individual records, just anonymizable? You mean cost of production, or? That only those that are about to retire and exit the industry get this above market price for their, regardless of size, yes. Yes, sir.
How about funding a bond like that? I mean, we hate to say this, but on the consumer side, I mean, for every unit of milk sold, put on a 1 cent or 2 cent, and then do that over a period of time, that, you know, to get rid of it. I mean, instead of, there are a lot of things, we front all the money for all these programs to get rid of our stuff. Consumers, you know, they just take
Yeah. So,
to help us with this.
yeah. So the question was, how about imposing a levy on the consumers rather than producers, so that whoever buys the fluid milk in the state would have a special surcharge of a cent or some amount of money, and that pays for the bond, pays for the payback of this bond. Did I understand that correctly? Yeah. That is certainly something that if this bond idea gets to the phase 3 and then be a final idea, something that the committee could propose and try to negotiate with the state. You will have noticed that even though we have a lot of ideas today, 11 ideas presented, there are some ideas that we heard that did not make it to today. We worked with the technical committee, with the people that have studied quota for a long period of time, and we asked them, are there some ideas that are whose probability is low enough that they should not be prioritized for a meeting that would take 3 hours, essentially. And that's why I didn't start off with that. But certainly, if the bond idea is the one that the industry strongly feels for, and it really makes it to the final stretch, this could be one of the tweak that you could try to pitch to the state and see whether it flies. Yes, yes. That is correct, yes. So this would be considered a tax if that were to happen, and you would have to convince the state that it's in the public interest to do that, yes. It's 12:20. Yes, yes, ma'am. Well, this will be the last question in this section, and then we'll move on. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
For the bond question, I'm just curious, so the assessment for underweight is actually based on current milk production, correct? So let's say in 15 years, there's a big recession, and a lot of dairies go out of business, milk production goes way down, and all the producers left in the market, their assessment for underweight will potentially go up. Is that right?
The question was, what happens to the assessments per hundredweight needed to pay off the bond if the milk production radically declines? Your proposed answer is correct. If the milk production radically declines, then the remaining dairies would be on the hook for more money to pay off that bond. That is correct. We do anticipate the analysis that you've seen there in this table does assume milk production that is neither growing nor declining. In our analysis on the 10-year trends, we do not see a fast growth in California, but we also don't see an apocalypse that would decimate the milk production in the state. We still believe there's a business case to be made for dairy industry in California. We're optimistic about your future, guys. Okay, so I will make myself available for any further questions after the meeting, but in the interest of time, I would plead the room that we move on now to the third section, the third session on the proposals, and Matt will take us through the proposal J, which is quota termination. So all three ideas in the last session have to do with the different ways to terminate quota. Quota termination calls for immediate termination. You've heard from Don that it really just means one more year and then the referendum and then it's done. Sunset is a kind of termination with delayed effect. We will go through the termination referendum first. Matt.
Okay, so this is Proposal J, quota termination. I think the idea of termination was talked about plenty earlier by Don in Marin about what it would take to terminate. As we go through the proposal on termination, I want to talk more about who it'll affect and what parts of the state will be affected and what size of farms will be affected for the purpose of having a deeper understanding and intuition about the effect, how termination will change milk production in the state and that kind of thing. To start, I'd like you to identify which zone you are in the state. So this is a map on the right of the different RQAs, and then the different zones. Zone 5 is Fresno, Kings, and Tulare. That's with the lowest RQA. Zone 1 is Southern California with no RQA at all and the highest quota pay price of $1.70. Please know your zone, as we're going to talk about how termination would affect quota. Currently, depending on where you are in the state, in aggregate, regions are either net beneficiaries from the quota program, meaning that they receive more money from cash flows each month than they pay in assessments, or they're net payers, meaning that they pay more than they receive. The part of the state with the lowest RQAs, this zone 5, who have, relatively at least benefit least from owning quota, they happen to be the region that also each month contributes the most money to the QUIP program. So when you look at it by region, that zone 5, which is Fresno, Kings, and Tulare counties, every month they contribute on net to QUIP about $2 million. All other regions in the state are roughly break even or net receivers, with the regions that depend or receive most money being Zone 1, which is Southern California, and Zone 2, which is, of course, Northern California here. If QUIP were to terminate then, by region, the part of the state that would receive an immediate income boost would be that Zone 5, those 3 counties. And then all other parts of the state would, in aggregate, see revenues decrease. And so when you're thinking about, well, if QUIP terminates, who will be made worse off, so to speak, the hardest hit in aggregate, not an individual producer, but in the total industry in a region, would be this zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3. So in our proposals, we'll see that we propose things that treat zones 1 and 2 differently. This chart on the left shows the percentage, the average percentage of quota owned by a zone, and in zones 1 and 2, about half of the milk production in that area is already covered by quota. So if quota were to eliminate, there's a concentration of quota in those areas, and you'd expect zones 1 and 2 to be made the worst off. As a result of that, we have other proposals that say, well, what happens if we target zones 1 and 2 and make exceptions, treat them a little bit differently because of this hardship kind of reality. The last idea I want to talk about on this slide is that there's often talk about, well, and we talk about it some in our memo, well, if quota goes away, then there are some producers that are very dependent on quota. And so we could see overall milk production decline in the state. I just want to offer the counter thought to that is that while there's areas of the state that would see revenues decrease, we do have this major milk producing area which would see revenues increase in aggregate if quota were to go away. And then the second idea is somebody asked earlier about, well, why in the proposals did we talk about small farms? So this is the chart that shows the average percent of milk production covered by quota depending on the farm size. And you can see that these farms that produce less than 200,000 pounds of milk during October 2018, they own on average more quota than the rest of all the other size farms. And so we separated them off saying, well, if you terminate quota, it's going to be these guys who are hardest hit. But you can also see that there isn't a clear trend for the rest of the size of farms. So there's this idea out there that only small farms own quota, large farms don't own quota, and we were pushed to investigate that. And what we find is there actually isn't a very clear trend between average farm size and quota ownership. So those are two impacts that I just wanted to kind of point out. We have these regional impacts and then the size of farm impacts. The last one, and these numbers are too hard to read, but you can look at the colors. And I just wanted to spend a moment to talk about the risk of termination. We estimated in the chart that we started off with, that had the 65% line and the 49.1% line. And you could see that we had crossed that 65% threshold and not crossed it and crossed it again. So this is kind of data that we went further where we said, well, what would happen depending on different levels of voter turnouts? So if all the producers that are currently net beneficiaries showed up to vote and say only 90% of net payers into the quota showed up, what would happen to quota? If you at a referendum, would a referendum at a 65% threshold pass, which is in the green, or would it fail, which is in the red? And you can see that under no situation is there all red, and under no situation is there all green, meaning that depending on voter turnout, you can come up with an estimate that has the quota program terminating, or depending on voter turnout, given where numbers are today, you could have quota pass at that, or you could have quota sustain, continue on, the referendum would fail, depending on turnout. And this is just to emphasize that the uncertainty is real about the outcome of a referendum. With that, Marin will walk you through the survey.
Oh, the next one is this one. Okay, so we are now on page 9 of the feedback booklet. So at the top of the page, you will again find our summary. Notice that there is one part that is bold and underlined. To the best of our current understanding, this is the summary of the conditions under which the petition would lead to a referendum. I'm going to ask you first to answer the question number 2. I'm going to read it and then explain it. Holding the referendum under Chapter 3.5 rules, which is the 51 majority needed to continue QIP, holding that referendum is fair. Now, if you believe that the Secretary has the discretion whether to hold a referendum or not, if that petition goes in, do you believe it is fair for the Secretary to hold that referendum if the petition comes in? If you believe that it is fair, that the referendum should happen, then you should answer strongly agree. If you don't believe that that particular referendum is fair way to adjudicate the issue at hand, then you should answer strongly disagree. I'm just going to go question by question because in other meetings, people got a little bit tripped up by this page. There's a lot on this page. So answer that question first. Question number 1 is very similar. Do you believe that it is fair that a referendum should be held on this, that requires 65% majority to terminate QIP? If you believe that such referendum is fair, please answer strongly agree. If you believe that the 65% referendum is not fair, please answer strongly disagree. The third question is stated in the affirmative. The sentence is, I would vote to support QIP termination under Chapter 3, where 65% is needed to terminate QIP. If you would indeed vote to terminate QIP on that referendum, please state strongly agree. If you would not vote to terminate QIP, in other words, if you'd be supportive of continuing QIP, then please, on that question, put strongly disagree. If you don't know what you would vote, you have these options in the middle. The fourth question is regarding the Chapter 3.5 referendum, the 51% threshold. Now recall, that referendum is the one that needs to pass to keep the QIP in place. And if it fails, QIP goes away. So if you would vote to keep QIP in place, if that referendum were to be called, please answer strongly agree. If you would not vote to keep QIP in place, in other words, if you would like that referendum to kill QIP, then please answer strongly disagree. If you're not sure, you have options in the middle. There was a request to repeat, so I'm repeating the question 4. The question 4 reads, I would vote to continue QIP under Chapter 3.5, where 51% majority is needed for referendum to pass. If you want to keep QIP and that referendum takes place, please answer strongly agree. if you would want the quip to go away, and that referendum is a way to do it, please answer strongly disagree. And the final question, multiple choice question on that page, deals with a referendum in 2020. So you've heard Dina, you've heard Craig in the beginning. By farm show, we should have our final idea. And if we don't have it, whether at that point or sometimes before that point, the Stop Quip would likely file a petition, whether it's 3.5 or 3.0, it's their decision. But if we do have a referendum, now this is a thought experiment where we do have a referendum to terminate quip in next year, and you heard from Don that would be most likely sometimes in the summer or late summer, early fall. If we do have that referendum, and if on that referendum quip is terminated, what would be the effect on your business? Would you expand the dairy herd to stay competitive? Would you get out of dairy business sooner than you otherwise would? Would you diversify your income but keep milking? Or maybe your business plans would not be affected at all. Or if there's something else, please illuminate us. We have 20 minutes left to go through the variations, through 4 different flavors of the sunset. Did you want to do the base sunset? Or am I doing all of this? Okay. So I'm going to go first through the base sunset, which means everything stays the same as it is right now, right today. One change. We set a date when the quip turns into a pumpkin, right? There's a number of years, and at the end of those years, quip is no more. So that's the basic sunset, or base sunset. That's proposal F on page 10. So what do we have here? This gives you 10 alternatives. Sunset that is only 1 year in duration, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 10-year sunset. Over the life of the sunset, nothing changes in this particular flavor. Nothing changes versus how it is today. So what this says is that after 3 years, over those 3 years, a pound of quota would receive $214 if you were in zone 1, which is an example, Chino. It would receive $180 in cumulative monthly payments if you're in zone 5, Tulare. If you're somewhere in between, it would be between $180 and $214. That's after 3 years. After 6 years, you're now up to $400 or $350, depending on where you are. So let's say that we set the sunset at a certain level. I'm going to give an example of 3 years and 6 years. It can really be anything. I'm not nudging you in a particular direction. If we choose a sunset of 3 years, if you take all this cumulative cash flow that you would receive as an owner of quota, and if you discount that at 5% to bring it to present value, then the value that a person in Chino would be willing to pay for that quota today is $198. For an owner in Tulare, that quota would be valued at $167. To get to 250 in Chino, you'd need 4 years. To get to 250 in Tulare, you'd need 5 years. And then you can read these numbers on your own all the way up to 10 years. Now, I'm asking you the same questions as before. Is it fair? Easy to understand? Would you support this proposal on a referendum? I'm also asking you a new question that we haven't asked before. I'm asking you to circle one of these numbers, 1 year, 3, 4 years, 7 years, or 10 years. And what are you circling? I'm asking you, what would you personally be willing to accept? But not only are you willing to accept, but what do you also think will be acceptable for others so that a consensus can be reached? In other words, where do you see the consensus happening in a way that you're also pleased with? I'm going to go through all 4 flavors of the sunset, and then we'll open for an extended discussion to answer any questions you may have. Okay, so the next flavor of the sunset is the one in which we not only set the date, but we also equalize RQAs. What that means is that you will get the same money every month for a pound of quota no matter where you are. And in this particular example, we are setting it to the Tulare level. Now, it doesn't matter in which zone you are, and this is the cumulative cash flow discounted at 5%, so this is the present value, which would presumably be the quota value on the market if you set the sunset at 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. In other words, if you believe that a fair price for quota, the one that would generate a consensus, is $473, then you think we should have 10 years. If, if you believe that the fair value of quota, the one that would be acceptable to both quota holders and the stop quip, is $217, you would circle 4 years. And you can circle anything between 1 and 10. The same question before. If this flavor of the sunset is pursued, how many years do you think would be acceptable both to you as well as the other side and your side in the debate? So what number of years would be something that would generate a consensus in a way that you are also pleased with? And the same questions as always: is it fair? Is it easy to understand? Would you vote to support it in a referendum? Okay, so this is how much you would get per 100 of milk every month. So you would get $1.43. And this is how much assessments would be every month. It would be 34 cents per 100. Okay. Moving on to our third variation of the sunset, proposal E2 on page 12 of your feedback booklet. On page 12, now we consider a sunset in which some regions get a longer sunset than others. And again, keep in mind, I'm not advocating for any solution, I'm just giving you options so that you can engage in informed decision-making that considers a broad range of options. So in this particular proposal, there is in Zone 1 and Zone 2, which is exemplified by Chino and Petaluma, they would get 3 more years of sunset. So the sunset would happen after 5 years for everyone else, but 3 more years for these 2 regions. A justification, a potential justification that the dairy community may offer is that these 2 regions are most likely to see the most adverse consequences of quota going away, but because there's more milk that is covered by quota down south and up north. Now, in the feedback booklet, I'm asking you now to be the judge. There's a question there that says, how many additional years should be approved for Chino and Petaluma regions? If you believe that everybody should be treated the same, you should answer none. Everyone should be treated the same. If you believe that due to the circumstances, these 2 regions should be given longer sunset, you can indicate how many additional years would you find agreeable? 1, 2, 3, 4 or more. One item that I want to draw your attention to is that the amount of assessments that would be needed for these additional 3 years is only 6 cents per 100. So in other words, if all grade A milk in the state continues to pay assessments for 3 additional years so that the quota holders in zones 1 and 2 can keep on receiving payments for 3 more years, it would cost the industry 6 cents per hundred for those additional years. A question was asked in the previous 2 meetings this week, well, wouldn't you be buying more quota if you were in Chino or Petaluma? If the quota is after 5 years, if the quota is worth 0 for a dairyman in Tulare, wouldn't you just buy it for pennies if you're in Chino or Petaluma? There are 2 ways to address that. You can either introduce a legislative change to prevent that from happening, or if you don't want to mess with legislation, keep in mind that these 2 regions can only buy so much quota to fill up to 100% of their production. If they were to fill up all the way up to 100%, the assessment would go up to 12 cents per hundredweight. The question that you're being asked is to provide feedback on whether any additional years should be approved for some regions, and if yes, how many additional years? We have one more flavor of the sunset, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions on sunset, and we've left plenty of time to go through that. So the last idea, the last sunset idea, is what we call a step down. In all previous ideas, you have program going on the way it is right now, or with some small changes, and then boom, it's gone. In the step down, every year, the assessments go down. Every year, the quota payments go down. So it's sort of like tapering off rather than going on for a while and then nothing. One argument for tapering off would be that if you have consistent signals that the system is about to go away, that incentivizes everyone to be more proactive in redefining their business if they need to, in order to be a winner in the post-quota world. Also, perhaps if the assessments keep on declining every year, then maybe the stop quip guys would be more willing to accept to a longer sunset. That is something that needs to be determined, of course, in negotiations. It's not up to me to speak on their behalf. But this is one illustration of that principle. It doesn't have to be 10 years. But in this particular illustration, we are taking the sunset to 10 years out. So there will be some quota payments going on if we implement this in 2020 all the way up out to 2029. And then take a look at this here. If we don't equalize our RQAs, then this would be the payments per hundredweight that would accrue to each region. So in Chino, you would go from $1.70, $1.53, $1.36, et cetera, In the last year of the program, only 17 cents, and then it goes away. In Tulare, it would go from $1.43, $1.28, a buck, et cetera. So every year, 10% is taken off, so that after 10 years, it's gone completely. The assessments start at 37 cents, and then go down to 33, 29, 26. So about 2 or 3 cents lower assessment every year until they go away as well. On the final page of the booklet, you may also suggest to us, well, why don't you combine this, for example, with equalizing RQAs? And if we do that, then everybody would be facing the same schedule as Tulare, or everybody would be facing the same schedule as Chino, whichever way they are equalized, up or down. For this last variation of the sunset, we are asking you, how many years should it take? That is the fourth question in the middle of the page. If QIP is to be terminated using a step-down approach, how many years would you personally support for a sunset? And you believe can also generate sufficient support to be approved on a 65% referendum. Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10, or maybe more than 10? Some of you may not feel ready to provide a feedback yet. Perhaps you want to ask a question. That is okay. I'm now opening the third session for the discussion. Any question on the termination or any of the sunset variations would now be appropriate.
3 questions.
3 questions.
3 questions.
All righty.
Is there a quota for sale?
I don't have any. There is.
There is quota for sale. Does or does not quota return a 10 to 15% net return on your investment at the current price? The answer is yes.
Actually, it returns more right now.
Yes. Why are we going through this exercise? It is not a closed program. Everybody can join. Why are you not buying and investing in quota?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Actually, that was 0 questions. Let's continue with the Q&A, please. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I would like to see the slide you had up there with the percentage of the people in all the zones that have quota, because the one option you have there, no, going back to the one with the bar graph, or zone 1 and zone 2, go back quite a bit. One more maybe. Yeah, right there.
Yes?
So which one is 1 and 2 on your graph there?
Okay, so on this chart here, these two are zones 1 and 2. So they have between 40 and 50% of quota of their milk covered by quota. In this chart here, their contributions or draws. They are the top line here. So this means $1 million every month. And this is zone 2, which is about $250,000 or maybe 400,000.
And those are the ones you wanted to extend. What's that? Those are the ones that we would possibly extend into one option?
So on a net basis, as a total region, zone 4 is about break even. I don't know, which is this red line, and then zone 3 on a net basis is positive. But when you break it down into a per hundredweight basis, it works out to be about a nickel because of all the milk produced in that region. The other zones 1 and 2 on a per hundredweight basis, it works out to be around 50 cents a hundredweight. They're net receivers from the program in aggregate.
Thank you, Matt. More questions, please, on these 3 proposals? Anything that you would like clarified? Yes, sir.
What's the production pounds within the regions? A, the north of region 5. What's the average production in those?
As a share of the total state?
Yes.
Do you know those we should have had that. We apologize, we don't have that chart ready here. In general, zones 1 and 2 are quite a small share of the total production. That's why it would only take about 6 cents for them. If you're leaving the meeting early, please do not forget to complete the last page. The last page asks you to rank these alternatives. Indicate 1, 2, and 3 for your top 3 proposals. We will use the ranking in order to trim the set of ideas from 11 down to 3. Are there further questions that we can help answer on termination or sunset? Yes, sir.
I just want to make sure there wouldn't need anything with the state if we get a sunset, right?
Most likely not. You would only need to go to the state if you wanted to make sure that no further referendums would be possible. You would have to go to a state for that. My understanding is that that would probably not be a heavy lift with the state. If the entire industry coalesces around it and there would be nobody who would be putting billboards in Sacramento arguing against it, right? Yes, sir.
The other question is the very first thing here, E1. The only difference between that and everything else is regional is all equalized.
Yes, so the question was, what is the difference between the base sunset and E1? In E1, all RQAs are equalized, so it doesn't matter where in the state you are, you get the same amount of dollars per pound of quota. Yes. Any other questions that we can entertain? If there are none, please, Stephanie, of course.
Not on these last three, but I'm just confused. Is there another proposal that does include and incorporate keeping quota and any possible modifications to keeping quota?
Yes. So we were given the charge to look at the ideas that for reform. There is no action needed to keep the quota, right?
No, that's not actually true. You could modify it in a way that possibly adjusts how quota is drawn. Getting rid of the federal milk market order is one of those things. There's other ways to kind of include or reroute where those monies are coming from. You and I talked about that before up in Petaluma. But none of these actually include keeping quota.
The first three ideas preserve quota. Tying quota to Class 1 sales, equalizing RQA, and the quota stabilization, all three proposals are designed or presented to try to preserve quota.
All three of those things circulate the money, and we just end up paying for it ourselves. We don't actually modify it in a way that it benefits quota holders.
They do modify the way the quota benefits quota holders because they change the monthly payments for per pound of quota.
But then if you adjust my RQA, I just pay more.
Yeah. Well, so the stabilization does not change any rules, for example, if that's your question. Yeah. So if you believe that there should be additional ideas proposed, there will be regional meetings of the dairy families groups in your region, and Dino is going to speak about that. In the interest of time, I'm going to close my part here. At the end of the meeting, we have set aside a few minutes for the Stop Quip and Dino to close the meetings. Is there anyone from Stop Quip that would like to say a few words? I see AJ coming to the stage. Before AJ speaks, I just want to say, if you wish to engage in a dialogue with AJ or Craig, there will be time for that after the meeting is formally closed. So this is just an opportunity for AJ to make a statement and Dino to make a statement. I'm not going to encourage a dialogue at this stage.
Thanks, Mark. So I guess at the end of the day, the guys who have quota, they should think about what the odds are that we're going to go to a referendum under Chapter 3.5. Personally, I think they're very good. So when you're thinking about what you're marking on your papers, that's what you should think about. And also, I'd like to say that I think that milk sales are going to skyrocket because we're going to take down the billboards. We don't think we need them. So I think we're about done. The one thing nobody's talking about is we don't think that the QIP was implemented under the correct procedures. So we can file a lawsuit, and we have it drawn up against the state that we think it should be terminated immediately. So that, I think, is a bigger risk than 3.5. That's just something else for you guys to think about as you're thinking, if you're thinking, how do we get out of this? If you don't think anything's a risk, then don't do anything. That's fine. And we don't care. But I'm just telling you that's what we're going to do. So trying to be honest with you guys.
Thank you, AJ. Again, AJ and Craig have made themselves available for direct conversations in the previous two meetings. You can find them at the back of the room. Dino.
Okay, I want to thank you guys for coming. I want to address a couple of things with the room. Number one, make sure that on the back you fill out your three favorite or least hated plans, however it works out, and rank them 1, 2, and 3. Okay, it's important to do 1, 2, and 3. The other thing is with the committee meetings that are coming up in the next couple of weeks, if you want to participate in those, we need to be able to contact you, so make sure that you either go to our website and give us your email or you leave it at the door on the way out. Now, regarding the rest of the process, I talked about the timeline earlier today, but I want to talk about another part of this that we need to work on. Right now, today, and our process outlines basically an economic conversation about what to do with quota. But there are other areas that we have to work on. And there's kind of an emotional and a spiritual aspect to this thing in the industry. And in order for us to move forward and to succeed as an industry, it's important for us to get our families back together. So we need to stop fighting. We need to, I appreciate that AJ's taken down the billboards, and I would also appreciate that we would stop fighting on Facebook. I would appreciate if we would stop putting up ads and communicating and calling other dairymen thieves and calling people liars. We have to get past this part, or we can't do anything together. We have to get past this. So I'm going to ask as an industry that we take whatever, anger and whatever animus that we have and try to push it aside while we consider this process. Because even if we agree on, the math on this thing, we still have to live with each other afterwards, right? So let's be good to each other. Let's be kind, and let's make this thing happen and get it over with so that we can all go back to having, family dinners and things like that without this being an issue. Because, when I'm not in this room, whenever I see another dairyman, regardless of what side of this issue they might be, and I see them as a dairyman, right? And that dairy person is my brother. And the fight that we have is with the vegans, with the environmentalists, with the California legislature. We have bigger fights, and we need to be together. So with that, I appreciate you guys coming. And regarding AJ's discussion about the lawsuits, there's three things that are potentially could impact quota at this point. There's the 65% referendum, which we all know about. There's the 50% thing, which you learned about today, maybe for the first time, and then there's this lawsuit that they alluded to. There's really only two ways that we can solve this. One way would be through one of those three means, in which case would take a lot of time, a lot of money. There's two lawyers in this room right now who are going to make a crap load of money on any of those things, right? There's a bunch of money in that. There's a bunch of time in that. There's a bunch of fight in that. And there's a bunch of angry and hateful people that are going to get together, and it's not going to be fun. Or the other way is to continue with this process and honor the opportunity that this process is to the industry in finding something that we can do together that will cost us nothing. It costs us nothing to be together and to do this thing right. So my recommendation is that you guys stay with the process, participate, make it happen, and let's come to a decision. And once we've made that decision, let's just move on. Okay? This is my recommendation to all of you, and thank you for coming.